time to join this Crook Public Service Fellowship event this evening. I'm John Flynn. I'm Director of Research and Innovation for the Faculty of Social Sciences here at the University of Sheffield. I'm delighted to welcome you, those of you who are on the Zoom call and also those who are viewing through the U channel. And I'm delighted to introduce our speakers and panellists this evening. The Crook Public Services Fellowships were established and generously funded by Professor Tony Crook, CBE, to support transformative partnerships between University of Sheffield academics and future leaders in public service. Tony wished to enshrine his own commitment to public service through a mechanism that enabled academics and public service professionals to collaborate, to learn from each other, and crucially, to use the new ideas and understandings forged in these partnerships to enhance public policy and practice. And I think this has undoubtedly been achieved through several cohorts of Crook Fellows addressing a wide range of policy fields. It has also enabled further continuing and new collaborations. Zoe and Daniel's projects, which we'll hear about tonight, are further exemplars, I think, of these achievements. And I would like to commend their reports to you, and we'll provide the links so you can access those reports for yourselves. They were our 2021 fellows with a shared theme addressing regional economic restructuring in cooperation with the 2070 Commission, including a focus on the Levelling Up agenda. Zoe Billingham was formerly in the Centre for Progressive Policy and is now Director of IPPR North. And Zoe has worked with Dr. Matt Wood in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Sheffield, looking at the accountability of mayoral combined authorities. Daniel Timms is a senior consultant in Metro Dynamics. Daniel worked with Dr. Aidan and has since gone on to work with Dr. Jessie Matheson in our Department of Economics. Daniel and Aidan's project explored the measurement, the monitoring, and the improvement of the resilience of places to economic shocks across the UK. I would also now like to briefly introduce our panel members to you. Dame Kate Barker is not here yet, but as many of you know, Kate Barker holds a number of roles, including Chair of Trustees for the British Coal Staff Superannuation Scheme and Chair-elect of the University's Superannuation Scheme. Kate's a non-executive director at Man Group and Taylor Wimpey. She also chairs the Jersey Fiscal Policy Panel, and as many of you will know, Kate was a long-standing external member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee and conducted a major independent policy review of UK housing supply and subsequently a review of land use planning, which has been very influential to many of us working in these fields. And she's also served on the National Infrastructure Commission, which is obviously of direct relevance to this evening's discussion. Stephen Aldridge, CB, has been Chief Analyst and Chief Economist and Director of Analysis and Data Directorate since 2011, and he continues in this role at the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. Stephen was previously Chief Economist and then Director of the Strategy Unit in the Cabinet Office. Stephen has been Chair of the Cross Whitehall Analyst Group on Public Sector Efficiency, set up by the Government Economic Service. Stephen is also a Fellow at the Centre for Science and Policy at the University of Cambridge and an Advisory Board for the ESRC UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, which is co-located at the University of Sheffield. And our third panel member is Dr. Aidan Weil. Aidan is a Senior Lecturer in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning and at the University of Sheffield and Deputy Director of the Sheffield Urban Institute. Aidan is recognised internationally for his work in future cities and urban environmental policy. Aidan is a Depeng Visiting Scholar at the University of Xi'an in China. He's a board member of the Town Planning Review, and he's also been an associate editor for the Journal of Planning Theory and Practice, as well as a member of the ESRC's Policy Review College. Before I turn to Zoe, I would like to offer my thanks to several people, actually. Firstly, I would like to thank Tony for his ongoing generosity, his strong commitment, and his proactive engagement with the Fellowships programme. And I think that continuing support is a vital element to the success that's both been achieved, but we hope to continue to achieve into the future. I would like to thank Zoe, Daniel, Matt and Aidan and those that supported them for the excellent work we're going to hear about this evening. I'm most grateful to Kate and Stephen for giving up their time to serve in the panel this evening. I'd also like to thank Katie Brzezinski for supporting the Crook Fellowships programme and Lynette Hodges for her help with Katie in facilitating tonight's event. I'd also like to thank the Fellowships Advisory Board who provide invaluable insights and suggestions to make sure that we continue to ensure that Tony's scheme is everything we want it to be. I'd like to thank all members of the 2070 Commission who we worked closely with with this cohort of the fellowships. And also I'd like to thank Professor Craig Watkins, Faculty Vice President for Social Sciences, for the support he's provided via the University of Sheffield. Just before I pass over to Zoe, I just want to kind of illustrate, I think, how the Crook Public Service Fellowship scheme continues to grow and go from strength to strength. And we've actually got a new cohort of prize winners who are now being supported by Tony, and I thought you might be interested in following their work as that develops. So firstly, we have Professor Sue Yendall and colleagues in the new ESRC Centre for Care, based at the University of Sheffield, and their project is going to focus on the local experience of unpaid carers. We have Dr. James Weinberg in our Department of Politics and International Relations, who's going to be studying young people and political education. And thirdly, we've got Dr. Jenny Priest, who is also in the ESRC UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence. And Jenny's working with public and private sector practitioners and policymakers to consider the response to the ongoing cladding scandal, and particularly in the aftermath of Grenfell. In terms of the running order this evening, we will hear from Zoe and then Daniel, and then I will ask Kate, Stephen and Aidan to offer some reflections. And following that panel discussion, we will open the event up for further questions and comments. And we really would welcome your questions and comments. Those of you on the Zoom call can raise your hand and I'll come to you and you can ask your question directly. Alternatively, you can add questions and comments using the chat function, and we'll also be picking up the questions submitted by those of you who are viewing the event on the U-Player. So I think without any further ado, and with thanks to everybody, I'd now like to hand over to Zoe. Zoe, over to yourself. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that introduction, John. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm just going to share my screen as I have a few slides to talk you through my presentation today. Super. Hopefully you can all see that now. Great. Well, I have about 10 minutes just to go through with you and outline the research I've been conducting through the Crook Fellowship, which I'm really grateful to have been a part of. By means of brief introduction, I'm Zoe Billingham. I'm a Crook Public Policy Fellow in the Faculty of Social Sciences, and in my day job, as just been introduced, I work for a think tank called IPPR North. My partner in this research has been Dr. Matt Wood, who unfortunately can't be with us today, but he's a senior lecturer in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Sheffield University, and continues to be a great co-pilot on our work together. Thanks again, Professor Flint, for the introduction and for welcoming us relative outsiders into your university world, and to Professor Tony Crook for creating and funding the programme, as well as the board who have supported us all the way through. And of course to Katie, who's made it all very seamless and helped make it happen. So the question that Matt and I decided to address was the question of accountability of mayoral combined authorities. Seems a bit of a gnarly question, but in the policy world, this is really the question that I felt was the gap in understanding and policy in terms of where we take mayoral combined authorities next. There's a lot, of course, we've probably all heard it, wider dialogue about devolving greater powers, more finances, more funding streams to metro mayors. But then the question begs, well, how do we hold them account, and how do they, and vice versa, hold government to account too? In terms of the next 10 minutes, I'm just going to again outline some of the benefits of the Crook Public Policy Fellowship, which has been such a pleasure to be part of, talk about how we arrived at our research question, and then discuss our methodology and emerging findings. Just in terms of where we're at in the project, we're actually midway through our qualitative interview, so I will be sharing emerging findings only. As we got more and more excited about the project, it snowballed into a larger piece. So we will be publishing later this year, and it'll be a pleasure to share it with you all. But firstly, just in terms of the fellowship itself, as you said in the introduction, it's really a space for academics and policymakers like myself to work together. And I think the focus on impact, obviously kind of the policymakers bringing together contacts, understanding of the policy cycle, the kind of political context, along with working with an academic like Matt, who brings, you know, a fount of all knowledge on all things accountability, a whole host of academic contexts, lots of ideas for a robust methodology, really has been stimulating both on a kind of academic and professional basis, but it's also just been a great project to be part of. And this is exactly why I wanted to join the fellowship. And I really think this fellowship, you know, is where things are headed. Like working in the policy world as I do now, I currently employ 2 academics, one from Leeds, one from Teesside University. And I think, you know, there's potential. Matt and I have already talked about potentially joint bidding in the future for research grants. So I think this has stimulated a kind of wider and broader discussion about how we could develop this work together in the future. So back to the research question itself. As probably is needless to say to this group, there's increasingly, you know, a political momentum, especially around the Levelling Up agenda and the Levelling Up white paper, and discussion of devolving new powers and funding streams to mayors. But as I said, it really feels like the gap is in the policy design around accountability. And actually through this process and through publicising this work, I was contacted by the head of mayoral accountability in the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities. So I'm really delighted now to be we're working and in conversation directly with government partners on this. So hopefully we'll have good impact as they look to answer these questions, but I'm sure Stephen can say more on that later. And the way that we have interpreted accountability here is twofold. It's both accountability to help ensure that local government is effective and achieving what it set out to do in those early devolution deals, and also upholding democracy by helping hold them to account. But we know that it's not a perfect system, and as it stands, there are many reasons why the current model actually hinders these 2 forms of accountability. And I've just set out a few here. Firstly, you know, there's no way actually to assess overall place-based spending and effectiveness. You know, we know that mayoral combined authorities have to respond to sometimes over 50 funding streams back to central government. And that makes it impossible both for the metro mayors themselves, but also for central government to actually take a whole place view and assess how effective that spending is at place level. And of course, this stifles innovation too. You know, part of the reason that we have devolution is to try and stimulate innovation in order to improve productivity and the integration of public services. But how can you do this when so much of your time is spent keeping up with all the different accountability mechanisms for all the funds that you oversee? And then, of course, this speaks to, you know, in a sense, the immaturity of the relationship between central government and mayoral combined authorities. Of course, they are quite a new model in this country, so I think we've got to practice a bit of patience here. But often what we see is the decentralisation of funding from central government to local government, and not the full devolution that we might hope for. And then finally, this is something that metro mayors talk about a lot, is that there is a mismatch in public expectation between what the public thinks they can do and the powers they have. And, you know, in terms of democratic accountability, that doesn't work for anyone. So this is why we thought this question in particular was the right time and important. In terms of how we're going about it, as I said, we are doing semi-structured interviews with elites. We've got a list together of devolution experts, academics, practitioners kind of on the civil servant side in both local and national government, but also, of course, politicians themselves. The types of things we're asking them, we're obviously very interested in their kind of overall assessment of the form, both the formal and informal mechanisms that they're held to account, and the sort of practicalities of how accountability works. Like, you know, do we have Michael Gove, as Secretary of State for DLUP, on the phone to metro mayors every week? Hardly ever. How does that work in practice? What does that look like? And we're also presenting them with this framework that is set out in the chart here, which brings together some of the, you know, latest academic thinking of kind of trying to systematize the different ways in which accountability is put into practice. So firstly, just there, the vertical accountability, perhaps the most sort of widely known, this is the legal rules governing how mayoral combined authorities go about business, and they can very much kind of issue sanctions and rewards to the mayors. So here we're talking about Parliament, we're talking about central government, but we're also talking about the cabinet members that make up the cabinets of which mayors are at the head of. Then we've got diagonal accountability. So this is kind of a range of organisations that have various oversight and monitoring responsibilities, like parliamentary select committees, even if they don't have the kind of power to hire or fire. And then horizontal accountability, which is a less formal type. It's more consultative. They don't have any formal powers, but it's often very important at a local level. So we're kind of testing this framework with them, using this framework to allow our interviewees to reflect on how accountability works for mayoral combined authorities as it stands. Just very briefly, without giving too much of the game away, given we're only midway through our research, but in terms of some emerging findings and some of the things we're hearing from our interviewees, I think firstly, just to say, there's a clear need for a two-way accountability. So whilst when people think about accountability, often they think about the accountability of metro mayors to central government and all the money that they're spending sort of thing. But actually there isn't a formal forum at the moment for metro mayors to be received by government. And as we saw during the pandemic, often metro mayors and government were speaking to each other through the media. And that seems to be a very kind of immature state of affairs. So I hope that, one of our recommendations might move towards a kind of more formal interaction between metro mayors and government, especially as there are an increasing number. Secondly, there's a sense that actually for those working or part of mayoral combined authorities, they feel like there's a lot of accountability already. So then there's a question of, well, is it visible and is it accessible to the public in the way that we'd hope? Is it the kind of usual suspects turning up to kind of scrutiny meetings, and how can we broaden that out to more democratically to a broader range of people? Then thirdly, obviously there's a different view of accountability, whether you start from the local government perspective or the national government perspective, and indeed locally, from the range of people who've spoken locally, accountability to the electorate and to the immediate mayoral cabinet is very much seen as the priority places. Several people during the interview process have cited the fact that Andy Burnham had a bigger number of voters for him than Boris Johnson, and this direct accountability to the public is really something that is felt very strongly at the local level. When we look at it from the national level, it's quite interesting because Parliament, actually, as it stands, we've been doing some investigation and doing some textual analysis of Hansard, as well as speaking to people within Parliament. Parliament, as it stands, seems to take kind of very little notice, if I'm honest, of metro mayors as it stands. And obviously, there's a difficult kind of political hierarchy that we need to bear in mind here. But there is a question, and there are ideas emerging in our project around different forms of political scrutiny of those metro mayors. So on that, I will leave it there for now. But really delighted to speak about your questions or reflections. I'm really excited for our discussion. In terms of next steps on the project, as I say, we will be publishing later this year the kind of final report. But we're already in touch with stakeholders across government and in discussion, and because I know that they are also looking to write their own accountability framework by the end of this year. So hopefully the stars will align, and the publication and of both government and our project will achieve the best impact it can. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Zoe. Excellent start to the series event, and impeccably timed as well. So very much appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed. So we're going to go straight on and hear from Daniel now. I'd also like to welcome Kate Barker. Thank you, Kate, for joining us this evening as well. But yes, Daniel, over to yourself.
Thank you very much. And may I begin, as Zoe did, by expressing my thanks to the University of Sheffield, Professor Tony Crook, and in particular to Dr. Aidan, who helps with putting together this paper. I'm Daniel Timms. I work at Metro Dynamics. We're interested in how places work and how we can make them work better. And the genesis for this piece of research was some work that we did with what was then MHCLG, now the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, focused on the economic vulnerability of places and resilience, and how we can try to understand how a place might respond to an economic shock. And just as we were finishing the research, it sort of moved from the hypothetical to the actual as the COVID pandemic shock begun. And so that got me thinking more about, well, how can we try to understand this as this happens? How can we monitor the resilience of places? And how can we think about how to improve it? So that big question I had was, how can we understand how resilient places are to an economic shock? And the first thing I thought I'd start by doing was by seeing if anyone else had attempted to sort of quantify this before or come up with a measure for resilience. And it turned out they had. I found a paper that had been put together by the United Nations. They have a Development Economics Research Institute. And at the start of 2008, a significant time in economic history, they put together a paper comparing nations for their economic resilience. And they built an index, and it contained things like macroeconomic stability, microeconomic efficiency, the quality of governance in a place, the sort of development and social development, education levels, and so on. So lots of sensible things to consider, you'd imagine. And the conclusion that it drew was that the most resilient country in the world economically was Iceland, top of the index. And not far behind was Ireland, which came out sort of second on that macroeconomic stability criteria. And of course, within a few months, both countries faced dramatic economic crises. Iceland's public banks all going into, Iceland's major banks going into public ownership, and Ireland going to the IMF. And so my question was sort of, how did they get it so wrong? You know, what they'd done seemed very sensible. They put together a lot of the things that you would pull together if you were thinking about economic resilience, and yet clearly the conclusions hadn't been borne out by reality. Now, in that case, what happened was they hadn't included the nature or the quantum of debt held by financial institutions within those countries, which of course turned out to be a major deciding factor. And in the same way, we can imagine that if we'd asked someone a couple of years ago to put together an economic resilience index of countries, they wouldn't have included things like the capacity of your health system, the number of international visitors you receive, your capability to produce vaccines at pace. But of course, those things have turned out to be very important for pandemic response and therefore for economic resilience. In the same way at the moment, you know, the amount of your oil and gas that you buy from Russia is a significant factor in your economic resilience if you're in the West. And so it's sort of tempting in the face of that analysis to think we should give up altogether on this whole notion of resilience or trying to capture it. But I think there are good reasons not to. Obviously, this work is developed in association with the Commission 2070. And the idea of the Commission is to take a long-term view of economic disparities, where have they come from over the last 50 years, and how can we try to reduce spatial economic disparities over the next 50 years. And I think if you want to answer that question, it's really important you take economic shocks and how places respond to them into account. I mean, most obviously, the shock of deindustrialization heavily affected some parts of the country more than others, and we can still see the legacy of that effect. I'll just now attempt to share my screen, he says ambitiously. There you go. Hopefully that's come up. This was some work that I did as well about looking at what's happened since the financial crisis in different regions of the UK. I'll just explain the chart quickly before I sort of say what it shows. What I've done here is on the y-axis, we've put gross value added. That's a sort of good measure of economic output. And on the x-axis, productivity hours, or the amount of hours worked in an economy. We've set both to be 100 for 2008, and then every sort of dot or triangle or cross on the line is another year. So 2008, 9, 10, up as far as 2018. Now, where you want to end up is in this top right quadrant, so where you have more hours worked, so more employment in your economy, and more than you did in 2008. In particular, if you can, you want to be in this top triangle up here, because that means your output's grown faster than hours, and therefore you become more productive over the time period as well. And what you can see is very different realities playing out in different parts of the UK. So we've got this green line is Herefordshire, Worcestershire and Warwickshire. That area has done very well. It's ended up well into that sort of top triangle. Output has grown by more than a quarter. But a very different picture if you look at this grey line down here for East Yorkshire and North Lincolnshire, where actually, shockingly really, output is still below where it was at the start of the financial crisis, or it was in 2018. West Central Scotland over here, that's Glasgow and its surroundings, increased output but less hours, and a different picture in inner London. And you can see that none of them really are anywhere close to this orange line, which is what's happened across the UK as a whole. And one quote that I came across quite early in the research, which is from Ron Martin, a Cambridge academic who's done a lot of the work on this theme, is he said, the memory of recession may linger much longer in some regions than others. The memory of recession may linger much longer in some regions than others. I thought that was quite an interesting idea, this sense of kind of almost the economy in some places remembers a shock for a much longer time than others. So if we want to understand how we can tackle some of these spatial inequalities, I think we really need to understand more how different economies will respond when there is a shock. So the next thing I wanted to do is I wanted to try to understand a little bit more what we mean then by resilience. Obviously, we're familiar with, it's useful and that it's a day-to-day term. But I think it can mean quite a few different things actually, economically, and therefore it's quite helpful just to tease them out. I'll just put up here. This is the Oxford Dictionary definition of resilience. It says, the quality or fact of being able to recover quickly or easily from, or resist being affected by, a misfortune, shock, illness, etc., robustness, adaptability. And within that sort of definition, I think there are at least 3 different ideas that could mean different things in terms of how a place responds to an economic shock. So the first is this idea of resist being affected by, or which I think is similar to this idea of robustness. That is, there's an economic shock and you don't feel it very much at all. So for instance, I see at the national level, unemployment increasing a lot, but in a particular place, a particular local economy, actually unemployment doesn't increase that much. And we might say that that was resilience. There's the second idea here, which is about sort of being able to recover quickly or easily from something. So resilience being more about the time period it takes to get back to where you were before or to recover. So in this situation, maybe the local economy also sees unemployment go up a lot, but the labour market is quickly able to reabsorb it and get back to where you were before. I think there's a third idea contained within this as well, which is that of adaptability and therefore the ability to change. So in this sort of situation, maybe unemployment increases, and what happens is the economy pivots to other sectors that are stronger or more resilient in response. So you've got these sort of 3 different ideas in how we think about resilience. And in my paper, I talk a bit about some of the other language that might help us to understand this a bit more. I think one idea that's quite helpful is to talk about exposure. So your economy might be exposed in the sense that you do a lot of your trade with one particular country. And so if there's a problem in that country or they go into recession, you're exposed. A lot of your employment is in one sector. And therefore, if that sector is affected by something, you're exposed. And I also explore a bit more this idea of adaptability and how we can understand the ways that economies change in response to shocks. The next part of my paper, I just talk a bit about if we are sort of going away from the idea that we can find one catch-all measure for resilience, nonetheless, how can we start to measure it, or what sorts of things can we use? And I think there's sort of a fairly classic approach, which is often based on using sectors and looking at sector presence in different places. So if we have a classic sector shock, we obviously want to know where are businesses in that sector or where are employees in that kind of sector. I think that has some merit as an approach, but I think we probably need to be a bit cautious about how far we take that. And that's for a couple of reasons. The first is that generally over the last 50 years or so, places have become more homogenous in terms of their sector mix. There's less clear distinctions between places, and therefore it functions less well as a predictor. I think also it's not always as obvious as we might think which sectors are going to be important in terms of the response to an economic shock. So again, if we think about the financial crisis, you might most immediately think about where's the financial sector located and expect those places to be more impacted. Of course, most of our financial sector is concentrated in London, an area that proved to be fairly resilient, certainly after the first couple of years, bounced back very strongly, much more strongly than places like East Yorkshire, which have a small financial sector. So I think sector measures are sort of semi-helpful, but we shouldn't rely on them too much to understand resilience. I think a couple of other areas which are maybe a bit more promising, or we should look to more. One is trying to understand networks in areas. So when I talk about networks, I mean sort of networks connecting firms and businesses and people within the economy. And this idea in network theory of some networks are more resilient than others. So what happens in a network if one node or connection is removed? Are there still paths across the network between different actors who need to connect? And I think that idea has a lot of promise and subject to further research. The other one, again, I don't go into this in much detail, but I think is really important to note is the role of institutions. Obviously, Zoe's been talking a bit about new mayoral combined authorities, and we could think about what impact that might have on resilience, the role of mayors to coordinate a response to a shock in some sort of event. We could also think about broader indicators like the amount of spare financial capacity that the council has to respond in the event of a crisis and provide financial support to vulnerable individuals. And then the final part of the paper is kind of trying to be more practical and think about, therefore, what can we actually do to understand resilience and to, most importantly, improve the resilience of places to an economic shock. We don't want to be in the situation where a shock happens, some places respond much better than others, and therefore we have this kind of growing divergence between places. And if I try to share my screen for the very last time, okay. We looked at the sort of three timelines, if you will, 3 time periods, before a shock, during the shock, and after the shock. And we developed one major recommendation for each. So I think before there's an economic shock, what needs to happen is we need to develop a stress testing culture to prioritise resilience over efficiency. Often, naturally, things tend towards efficiency, doing the most we can with the least possible. That often negatively affects resilience, though, because we have little spare capacity to act or change when a crisis happens. And I think a good example to look at, again, going back to the financial crisis, is what's happened in that sector since then. So following the financial crisis, the Bank of England started to introduce this stress testing exercise where every year they would sort of develop a model of a crisis that might happen, so the big drop in global GDP, perhaps a big change in commodity prices or housing prices. And banks would be expected to prove that they could meet this test were it to happen. They would have sufficient resources. They wouldn't go bust in this scenario, but that they could handle it. And if they can't handle it, the Bank of England has powers to compel them to increase their reserves, which makes them less efficient in a sort of narrow sense, but more resilient in a broader sense. And I do think within the recent shock we've just experienced, the wisdom of that approach has been demonstrated. Banks, certainly early in the pandemic, had to take quite a lot of the slack. They were offering mortgage payments, rent payments to businesses, those sorts of things. And they were able to do it because there was this kind of stress testing culture that had been developed. And so when we think about local economies and what that means, what I'm suggesting is that similarly, every year there might be some sort of scenario that was modelled. It could be major cyber attack, big flooding events, conflict abroad, another pandemic. We can think of what sort of circumstances might prompt an economic crisis. And then the exercise would be co-owned by local government and central government. They'd have to think about what would this mean in our place, where are our vulnerabilities, which businesses or people would be most affected, and expect us to draw up an action plan together about how they were then going to reduce some of those vulnerabilities. And I think practically that would work well because it would create a sort of accountability mechanism. You'd publish these things, and so no one could later say they weren't aware of the risk or the problem before it happened, and therefore you develop more of this sort of stress test resilience approach to build readiness into the local economy for when something might happen. Second time horizon, during the shock, our main recommendation is around monitoring and publishing real-time local level data. And I think that's something that we've seen really positively has happened during the pandemic. It's actually been a big advance for data publication. If we think about health data, at the start of the pandemic, we sort of had deaths and cases for the whole of the UK. As testing was rolled out and improved, we then saw that moving to sort of regional, local, neighbourhood type level data production. And I think that's a really helpful thing to do in a crisis or a shock, because at that point, you start to share that information and then others can analyse it and start feeding it back to you, the conclusions that maybe government itself can't see when it's responding to the crisis. So we saw a sort of proliferation of dashboards and data journalism pieces and so on that quickly identified, which areas of the country are people not taking up vaccines, which areas are cases spiking, and you can start to respond to that. And we should take the same approach, I think, to economic data. So things like high street footfall is obviously a big question at the moment. Which places are recovering well from the pandemic? Can we start publishing data on that in a sort of nationalised, standardised kind of way? Employment, where is that picking up or not picking up? And that data is starting to be produced. And then the final time horizon after the shock, I think what we've suggested here is target support effectively based on local need. The point being, again, that this quote about recessions may linger longer in the memory in some regions than others. Whenever a crisis ends, or at least at the national level, we think it's ended, psychologically, there's a strong impulse to sort of pretend it never happened. Obviously, the last few years have been quite traumatic for a lot of us, and we don't want to go over that. But actually, many local places don't have that luxury. They're still struggling with labour markets that have been affected, high streets that have been affected. They're not back to where they were. And so if we continue to monitor and publish this data and then target support based on that data, I think we can more effectively not end up in a situation where an economic shock happens, some places suffer, and then 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the line, you see big economic disparities. So thank you for listening. That's a short summary of the paper, and I'll hand back over to the moderator.
Daniel, thank you very much indeed. Excellent as well, and much appreciated. So, unsurprisingly, given the presentations we heard, we've already got some questions coming in, which is excellent. But before I open it up to the response to those questions, I'm going to ask Kate and Stephen and Aidan if they wouldn't mind giving us some preliminary reflections on the projects and what they've heard to get the conversation started. So, Kate, maybe I could turn to you first for your reflections and anything you'd like to ask or raise with Zoe and Daniel.
Thank you. I do have a few reflections on Daniel's paper. Unfortunately, I didn't see Zoe's paper in advance, and as you know, owing to a small excitement on the train, I didn't hear her presentation either. I mean, the first thing I wanted to say was that I think the whole Crook Fellowship idea is a great one, and the paper I have read is a very stimulating one and very current, because resilience is really to the fore at the moment. I'm quite interested in the focus that's come up on resilience, because after all, we've had lots of economic shocks in the past, and I sort of wonder whether we begin to pay a bit more attention to things like resilience when we're richer, when we can afford to no longer kind of carry on by the seat of our pants all the time. I did a bit of work on resilience, actually, of a rather physical kind, when I was on the National Infrastructure Commission. So we talked there about pre-crisis stress testing, not just central government, but also around, thinking about the potential for shocks from flooding and drought. I did a lot of work on water. And one of the comments I wanted to make was that I think in Daniel's paper that he discusses central government picking up the, sort of supervising the works on shocks and stress testing. And I kind of agree that central government has to be involved, particularly if you're going to ask them for money in the end. But it's important to think that some shocks and stresses are much more relevant to some places than others, not just geographic ones, but also sectoral shocks. On quick data, I think quick data is really interesting. It's interesting in some cases, but we have to be really careful about conclusions. When we look back over the period of COVID, quite a lot of the quick conclusions we drew, perhaps particularly about the labour market, weren't really right. I mean, Henry Overman, in the piece that you talk about in the paper says that it's not going to be clear what really went on for quite some time, and I think that's correct. So we now know, in fact, that the sectors we're really concerned about are health because of capacity issues, transport, I think we always knew we would be concerned about, stresses in the education sector, and retail and city centres, rather a varied set. But they're very different problems. So some of them, education and health, need more resources for a period, and that's more acute. In some parts of the country, it plays into the spatial awareness, and public transport may need more subsidy. Retail and city centres probably need fundamental changes, but we probably can't adjust them very quickly. What we know less about is the long-term productivity impact of this crisis, something we talk about today. Indeed, there are some union complaints about being asked to go back to work. You can't demonstrate we're less productive. And I'm sure that's true in a narrow sense. People have been quite productive at home, though some of them, I think, have been working more hours. It'll take a long time before we know what the impact of the loss of innovation and collaborative working has been. We don't know quite when it will appear, but one senses that it will. And unless we really know that impact, we don't know how much the whole country's productivity has been damaged. And so in some ways, we don't know how far it's feasible for us to support places. The strengths of this, I thought, were really good, with the important theme of having more spatial aspects of support we give. We're generally not very good at that. If we think about major factory closures over the years, they've often left far too much of an impact on places for far too long. And this may very well be one. I'm not always that keen on looking abroad, but looking abroad at how they have coped with factory closures is one way forward. And I thought the spatial aspects of support was a policy theme really well worth looking up. One of the comments I would make is that we're in a period now where we've got overlapping shocks. So when you're devising the stress tests, make sure that you think about what happens if you have 2 shocks at once or even 3 shocks at once, because that will help you to think about how big the overall issues can be and how best to tackle that is a challenge that we haven't resolved. So I think it might be easier to think about what the stresses might resolve in and harder to think about the right spatial policies to use, as in a sense we all know. So those would be my sort of quick top line comments. The last one perhaps is about resilience and specialisation. And Daniel's right that places are perhaps generally less specialised than they used to be. But equally, we often quite like specialised places because we think they have the thick networks in industry that we all like. But it does pose a risk to resilience. And so the question I have is, if we think that these specialised places are a good idea, they will then throw off wealth to the rest of us. And then when they run into difficulties, we owe money back to them. We have to support them. So thinking about the ups and downs of spatial policy, I think, is really important. Thank you for this opportunity to come along and comment on a couple of papers responding to what I think is a great idea.
Thank you very much indeed, Kate. Stephen, can I turn to you now for your initial reflections? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. Can I also applaud Tony for this scheme? I think it's so good, and so, we continue to need better engagement between academia and policymakers. So, all credit to Tony for this. And I really enjoyed both presentations, both papers, and actually, if in their different ways, they're both very central to the levelling up agenda and to the recent levelling up white paper. So really well chosen subjects. Taking Zoe's first, I mean, what I really like about what Zoe is doing is she's trying to bring some evidence to the way in which we design our devolution arrangements. And I say that because in part over the years, I've often sort of struggled with the evidence base here. So it's often quite hard to get a handle on what sorts of devolution or what sorts of devolved arrangements or what sort of devolution designs have the biggest, most effective impact on outcomes. And what I see in Zoe's paper is an attempt to address that. I liked the accountability framework that she set out, the vertical, diagonal and horizontal. a question, and I guess that she's seeking to get at this through the findings that Zoe reported. But what is the evidence in terms of what sort of framework, what sort of accountability arrangements are most likely to produce positive results? And it may be that an output from this work might actually be a framework for assessing and evaluating devolution arrangements in the future. One thing I wondered whether Zoe could attempt was whether there's any evidence that devolved bodies with more powers or certain types of powers are more likely to produce better outcomes for citizens than other types of devolved body. Very difficult, I know, but that sort of evidence would be really useful. One specific point, though, I'd make about what Zoe presented is I'd be careful about overdoing the accountability of metro mayors to central government, because the danger of that is that ministers continue to be held to account. So it may be that if you really want devolution and the devolution of devolved powers, you need to ask yourselves, how are those mayors more effectively accountable to local citizens in the places where they're elected? But I understand why Zoe is framing this as she did. In terms of Daniel's paper, again, it is a really timely piece of work. I like the emphasis on bringing resilience a bit more to the heart of economic policy making. Personally, I really like the emphasis on adaptability, agility and flexibility in factor markets, policy making institutions and so on. I just note that the recent Levelling Up white paper, of course, put a lot of emphasis itself on more geographically granular and more real-time data. One thing that looking forward, one might want to do is that in the Levelling Up white paper, the analysis is centred around 6 capitals, which it argues are essential for prosperity and well-being. So physical, financial, intangible, human, social, and institutional. And I think I would argue that those getting the right level and mix of those six capitals right, whether nationally or local, is no less crucial for resilience than adaptability, agility, and flexibility in the face of economic shocks. So institutional capital is crucial for providing the leadership, and perhaps more so the capacity and capability to respond. And there's a good link there then with Zoe's work. Social capital provides crucial underpinning for the social infrastructure that communities need to adjust to shocks. And maybe human capital is especially critical to resilience in the face of economic and other shocks. The adaptability and agility of people matters, dare I say it, perhaps even more than places or sectors. And it may also explain the finding in Daniel's paper that sectors alone may not be good predictors of what will happen in places. And then physical, financial, and intangible capital may matter not just because of their importance to existing economic activities, but perhaps even more so in the context of concern about the resilience of national and local economies because they underpin new economic activities. So in Daniel's paper, the furlough scheme is praised, and rightly so, because it has been effective in helping minimising scarring effects. But there are risks to those sorts of intervention in that they may protect existing activities and may hold back investment in new activities. So to some extent, I'm more cautious about prioritising resilience over efficiency. And that was brought home to me, particularly when I recently read Philippe Argion's new book, The Power of Creative Destruction. In many ways, economic shocks can be a good thing if they lead to beneficial economic change. So my challenge here would be, how do we combine beneficial economic change with social justice? In Argion's book, he emphasises an approach of flexicurity, where you combine very flexible markets with generous unemployment benefits and investment in training or skills that gives workers the ability to re-enter the labour market in different roles following an economic shock. So I'd just say be careful here that in pursuing resilience, you don't undermine dynamic economic change. It is actually a positive for our future prosperity and well-being. But these are great papers. Daniel's paper is brilliant, and there's much here to debate.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for another set of, I think, very considered and helpful reflections in terms of how we move these agendas forward. Aidan, could I ask you to reflect, obviously, both the project you're involved in, but also what Zoe's undertaken, and what Stephen and Kate have said.
Yeah, thanks, John. And I sort of thought I'd reflect also on the process, and it's been. I would echo what's already been said about the value of the Crook Fellowships and the way in which it opens up space and time for us to think differently, to forge all kinds of different relationships. And I very much enjoyed being part of that process. I think Zoe and Daniel have done extremely well, because that process was cut short, wasn't it? So and I got to know Daniel well because Daniel lives in Sheffield with me, and we were able to meet and to communicate. I'd like to got to know Zoe better, and I enjoyed the group meetings. But we got overtaken by COVID, didn't we, in lockdown? And I think it's an amazing achievement to produce this work and the reports in that context. And it's just a shame for me that we didn't have chance to do more of the round table work where we were talking across the different projects. And one of the things I want to talk about is the space in between these two projects that is sort of really valuable to start thinking about. But fantastic work, Zoe and Daniel, in getting the reports together and saying something meaningful and pushing at the boundaries of knowledge and understanding. And clearly I've got more investment and then more about Daniel's project, but I do also have an interest in Metro Mayors. I think where to start. I think one of the things is we were not only taken over by events in terms of the Crook Fellowship process, but also by the scale of changes around us. And I think for Daniel, so all of a sudden, resilience in the context of shocks took on it just took us somewhere we hadn't envisaged. So it made it very timely, but it made it also really challenging, because where do you place COVID within that? How do we deal with that? And we spent a bit of time saying, do we park some of this? And how do you park it? And I think in a similar way for Zoe, there's an interesting question about where mayors came through that process. So we've been through a shock which can shake things up in terms of economically and politically, institutionally. And I sort of was left reflecting a bit on where mayors where did they come out of that? And Andy Burnham clearly integrated Manchester, very sort of high profile role, a lobbying role. But then that seemed to end. And I think one of the things I was keen to watch with COVID is how quickly we returned to the state of affairs that existed before, what got shaken up and what didn't. And I think the big issue for the levelling up agenda is sort of what's dropped out of the equation, what's been reinforced through that. So a question for Zoe really would be interesting to reflect on. Where have mayors sort of gone after COVID? To what extent did, I think it was accountability relationship that was interesting there around relationships to citizens, mediating between central government, being closer on the ground, more agile, that was thrown up in the air. So I thought that was an interesting sort of question for the whole role of accountability, and a bit of a disappointment if one of the consequences that mayors didn't come out of that stronger. I'm not sure that they have. A similar question on that line is sort of where do we look for policy, and sort of Stephen's point about the different elements of levelling up. And I think those 6 points in the Levelling Up white paper are sort of weasel words. And it's interesting that, Stephen, as you got onto the meat of things, you talked about skills and some of the old language we used to use as economic geographers, even in the 1990s, and then it gets changed into a different language. But I was taken by the idea of mayors, sort of where could they make a difference? And Kate was talking about health and education and skills, and if we are to think about accountability and the difference mayors might make, how do we think about that sectorally? Where does that make a difference, and where does accountability matter, and accountability to whom in those sets of relationships, and does that vary? I do work on planning, so planning policy, does that's a marginal bit of mayors perhaps, but where does that sit in terms of accountability relationships? Daniel's work, resilience, was fascinating, wasn't it? And I think it made our head spin. We took it on, and it looked like it would be fairly manageable, but you got so many variables that you begin to open up that take you into different directions. I think one of the things that resilience makes me think about is reflection on what's there, what exists, what's vulnerable, who is vulnerable. And I think that point, Stephen, about sort of embedded skills, transferable skills, and I think asking the question about resilience makes us ask questions about what is there, what's valuable, what's vulnerable, how do we work, who works, in what context, what is the nature of the economy, how do we invest? And I was wondering, it sort of made me wonder that when we talk about resilience and shocks and the changing world around us, is it really so difficult to predict the future? Can't we identify certain sectors that we know in 20 or 30 years' time are going to keep on delivering economically? Zero carbon, investment in low carbon sectors, investment in health sector, automation, whatever it might be. And I suppose my frustration around some of the levelling up language is that there's a fairly straightforward job to be done about identifying potential areas where you can build skills, where you can embed flexible forms of work and economic activity, perhaps in places where you can bend investment in all kinds of ways. And I think one of the dangers is we get caught up with thinking that things are difficult to manage, that we can't anticipate the future. And I think, Daniel, that dimension of beginning to think about resilience in that term, in that sense, if we identify gaps and vulnerabilities, then how do we use the things we know about to try and plug them? And I think for me, that's at the heart of the levelling up agenda. I wonder whether we can begin to plan more than perhaps is presented in policy circles. So those are the issues. Those are the issues I want to raise. Really, there's lots more I could talk about. I think Kate sort of pulling through the issue of space matters, understanding place, and I made the sort of comment about old style economic geography, and I've increasingly gone back to the things we looked at in the 1980s, 1990s, and thought, have we missed something here around space matters, around the old language, and just going back to straightforward language about sort of skills, employment, jobs, and linking that to spatial justice. I think maybe we can cut through there. I think joining the space in between the projects is fascinating, and it's great that we're doing this to join it up, and I think we'd have done more of that if we'd have been able to meet in person. But I think the Crook Fellowships are the start of a journey, aren't they? And clearly for Zoe and Daniel, this isn't it. It's an ongoing process of research and thinking that builds on the connections you've made. So thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to listen to you and to make some comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Aidan. I'm very grateful for those insights, and indeed for your own work with Daniel on the project. We've got some questions coming in. What I plan to do is, I think I've got one question specifically for Daniel and one for Zoe, and I've asked Daniel and Zoe to give relatively brief responses to that, and then I think there's a number of themes in the other questions that I'll open up for some general reflections on before I hand over to Tony. So Daniel, if we start with you, there's a question, Daniel, about are there places that have traditionally been economically very resilient to shocks, but have found COVID in particular much more difficult to survive. I don't know if you in Aidan's research have identified any such places.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think I'm with Kate in saying in some ways it's too early to know where we'll end up or what the long-term impacts will be. Certainly, you would say at the moment, large cities, particularly large city centres that have been dependent on commuter populations coming in, have been negatively affected relative to where they were, which was, of course, a very vibrant economy in many places. Mentioned the work earlier that I've been doing with Jesse Masson at the university and also the University of Nottingham and Birmingham. It's really found that, you know, where we live is dispersed and where we work is concentrated. So this movement from working at work to working from home has really shifted demand patterns. And so some of those traditionally more resilient places like central London have been affected. I wouldn't want to predict, though, that they will be long-term losers from the pandemic by any stretch. I mean, I gave the example of the financial crisis and where there'd been that kind of large financial sector and yet a strong recovery. And I think we could well see that again. I think I'd also just tie to Kate mentioned kind of innovation and the role of innovation there. And not in my paper, but we've recently done some work with Cambridge on helping them to understand what's happening with their economy post-COVID. And this thing about networks and the role of networks in innovation is really interesting because, as Kate mentioned, if you don't have those connections in the same way, you're not making those sort of serendipitous encounters where you bump into someone who's working on something similar to you and you start collaborating, all that kind of thing, there could be quite long-term impacts on productivity. And it will be innovation hotspots, places like Cambridge, that will be most negatively affected by that, if that is the case. But we may innovate new ways of forming some of those connections. So I wouldn't want to say that for certain.
Thanks very much, Daniel. Zoe, if we could come to you, there's a specific question we've been asked about what your views on the levelling up directors and whether you feel that they will change the nature of government dialogue with Metro Mails, or whether primarily this is still a dialogue that needs to be held with politicians. So if you give us your thoughts on that, Zoe, please. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, partly it depends who Stephen decides to recruit. So no pressure, Stephen, on that one. But in all honesty, I think, look, information exchange between local forms, tiers of government and central government, more of that is only good. So I think it is pushing in the right direction. Obviously, they also are going to span a slightly wider geography than either just a local authority or even a combined authority. So in that sense as well, grouping together and having that interface between kind of regions, if you will, and central government is a good thing. I do think, though, and picked up in the question, in order to mature the relationship between local political leaders and central government, that relationship does need to be evolved, and that can't be done alone through kind of information exchange through levelling up directors who are non-political. So I think it's a good step, but it's, you know, not going to solve everything.
No, thank you, Zoe. And then I think when you look at the other questions we've got, there are a number, probably 3 themes I think that we can link to them, and I'll throw open to Zoe and Daniel, or indeed any of our panel members as well. So the first one is that balance and the relationship between the economic and the political, and the extent to which they both shape levelling up agenda or economic restructuring programmes, but also the relationship between them. Secondly, there's questions about the extent of devolution and whether we need to go further in terms of both political and fiscal powers. And then thirdly, and this is always the one we all enjoy, of course, are there places that we should be looking at, either in the UK or internationally, with Kate's caveat about the dangers of international comparisons, in terms of either accountability or economic resilience that we can look to as exemplars where we can learn from. So those three elements, the balance between the political and the economic, the extent of the devolution of powers, fiscal or political, and whether we need to go further, whether we've gone too far, whether we need to think about actually the balance of powers in a different way? And thirdly, are there any exemplars that will give us all, I think, some hope, if you like, in places that we could look to and learn from? So let me open it up to Daniel and Zoe, any of our panel members. Anybody want to come in with an initial response to, I know, a very, very huge agenda with very little time to go into detail. Does anyone want to respond to any of that?
I'm happy to kick off.
Thank you, Zoe.
Yeah, just firstly on the economic and political, I mean, I think they're inseparable, but I think it's also a question of identity. So I think it kind of almost goes beyond economic and political at this stage. They've tapped in through the levelling up agenda to something a lot more personal, I think, than even economic or political. Economic and political is part of the way, in my mind, that we deliver those expectations that people now have, that the agenda set. I must just say on fiscal powers, because I do love discussing this question, I think this is actually a really interesting one where the levelling up agenda and fiscal powers, hopefully those worlds will collide, because whilst I'm sort of broadly pro the further fiscal devolution, I don't think we should do it until places have been levelled up. And, you know, obviously, how levelled up is levelled up, that's then the grey area that's up for discussion and debate. But obviously, if we localised income tax, consumer taxes, etc., you know, places that already have a lower tax base would, in my mind, you know, potentially get into a kind of vicious circle. And so I think we need to kind of agree collectively where we think places should get to in terms of their own development and a reduction of regional inequality before we can take forward any large piece of the fiscal devolution. But I'm sure others on the panel have views on that, so I will leave that open to the floor.
Thank you, Zoe. Kate, do you want to come in? Raise my hand.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'd start off by saying that I agree with Zoe about the economic and the political. It's the older I get, the harder it is to not find them intertwined. I think when I was at the bank setting interest rates, we didn't feel it was very political, but now I look back and think actually there are some really political decisions or certainly distributional issues that get tied up with that. On Zoe's other point about fiscal devolution, that's absolutely right, Zoe. We can't possibly expect poor places to pull themselves up just by raising different taxes. People who want fiscal devolution are always wealthy places like Cambridge who think they'd like to be able to spend a bit more money. But I think fiscal devolution in the sense of local areas having more views on how they spend the pot of money they get from central government could be quite powerful. So it's sort of one of the points that's often made in this debate is that local authorities are kind of forced to bid for a set of pots that central government has decided would be good for them, not to decide, you know, which pots they would really like. And I think that is quite an interesting thing to look at. Places that have turned around, it's a good challenge to try and think of places in Britain that have turned around. And I sort of struggle with that. It's much easier to think of places that have gone down. We often talk about Manchester as having turned around, and that's certainly true in the centre. I suppose the only one I can really think of is a place that has, I can think of a couple of places actually, but they've mostly turned around because they have big neighbours. So Ely in Cambridgeshire, completely transformed from where it was 20 years ago, much more vibrant and interesting place. And I guess in a coastal town that seems, as far as I think has turned around, I haven't personally been there, would be Margate.
Mm.
Thank you, Kate. Anybody else want to come in? Yes, Stephen, thank you.
Yeah, just on places that have turned around. I'm not sure this is very helpful, but perhaps the greatest turnaround in the UK over the past, 40, 50 years has been perhaps London. So there might be some cause to reflect on what brought that about and what role devolution or not played in that. In terms of the political and the economic, I think there's a couple of points. One is that in terms of the economics, I think what we want here is ultimately to raise the potential growth rate in all parts of the country. That doesn't mean they'll all enjoy the same rate of growth, but they're all able to realise their economic potential. So I think it's really important to see levelling up as not a zero-sum game. Everywhere can do better. Right? And given my reference just now to London, the last thing you'd want to do would be to hold back successful places. In terms of the political, I think what for me is important, and it's stressed in the Levelling Up white paper, but you know, you can see this in other bits of the literature, is if you want to address some of the economic and social disparities we're talking about, you're going to need sustained, consistent action over a long period. And that requires the right sort of political commitment and the right sort of institutional arrangements. And that to me is where political and policymakers really need to focus. Get those arrangements right. And then in many ways, you could argue the economy will take care of itself. But, you know, for the last 100 years, or maybe even longer, we found that very hard to do. But maybe that's an issue for another Crook Fellowship project.
Great idea, thanks, Stephen. Aidan, do you want to come in before I ask Daniel and Zoe if they've got any final reflections before I ask Professor Crook to say a few words?
No, I've got nothing major to say, but I think that point about a long-term framework is very well made in all of this, and how you get those sorts of frameworks. I'm sort of struck. I'm into my history at the moment, my recent history, and sort of I am struck by the paucity of institutions for delivering the Levelling Up agenda. And I was struck when Daniel was doing his work on the data. Wasn't it a wonderful mechanism by any means, but I did quite a lot of work on training the enterprise councils. And they at least did the analysis of what the economy was like. I think, who does analysis on the local economy anymore? Who is in a position to understand what's going on? And I think that long-term framework requires an understanding. I don't know anybody who try getting a decent analysis of different local economies outside of the affluent areas. It's a very difficult job to get at it. And so where do we start from if we can't even get that sort of decent sort of picture analysis of what's going on? So long-term perspective and institutional frameworks, I think, have to be key. That's it from me.
Okay, thank you, Aidan. Tony, do you want to come in with a question? Because I think you've passed something to moderate, but it's not appeared in the chat. So Tony, yes, I think you've got a question.
John, I do, but I think I saw Daniel waving at that stage.
Well, apologies. Daniel, do you want to go first, and then I'll bring Tony in?
Okay, yes, sure. I was just going to come back to the kind of question of exemplars for resilience planning. Who does it really well? One group I've worked with quite a bit over the last year is Anglian Water, and looking at sort of flood management in the fens. And the example they really look to, in fact, no meeting is complete without the appearance of a Dutch flood expert who sort of talked about how they do it. And in terms of flooding, they really have that long-term view, because it's an existential question for them, really. Can they manage rising sea waters? And I think the question for us is, do we see levelling up as that sort of existential question for the country that is therefore worth having a sort of 100-year framework, or do we not?
Exactly.
Yeah, very, very significant question. Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, Tony?
No, John, you've invited me to make a few remarks at the end, and I'll do that if you still wish. I just wanted to ask Zoe a question about the role of mayors as much as about accountability. I mean, in your analysis, Zoe, with our colleagues, do you think they've got sufficient power to actually make a difference? I mean, I've been involved in some of the discussions about the plans for the Green Belt in Manchester, where the mayor wants to release more land in order to meet the housing need. But one authority is vetoing it, so nothing is happening. So although the combined authority mayor has some planning powers, they appear to be ones of persuasion. And if one of the 10 authorities says no, nothing happens. So have we got the powers of the combined authority mayors right? And they do vary, don't they? Because Burnham's got more powers in Manchester, but they seem to be ineffective. And Andy Street's got fewer powers in Birmingham, but seems to have some influence.
Yeah, absolutely great question. I think, I mean, what you're talking about is, of course, the veto power of one local authority over a whole combined authority. And I think, as you rightly point out, I think that has to be reviewed as per the area they're talking about, and whether that's actually relative to the size of the challenge that's being faced locally, having, especially in Greater Manchester, where of course they've got both Conservative and Labour constituent local authorities. So I think that sort of veto power and the margin with which they need to get through votes on other areas needs to be decided very carefully on each area. And I think linking to accountability is a bit chicken and egg, isn't it? Because we say, well, you don't have sufficient accountability for us to give you more, devolve you, either larger areas of power or larger budgets, but yet without more accountability, we couldn't do it. So this is why I'm really excited that Stephen's department is on the case with that, because hopefully we can do both at the same time, because as it stands, I don't think they have sufficient power to progress the combined authority model as we would hope. But we do have to remember, Andy Burnham was first elected in 2017, so it is relatively early days. So I try to be patient at the same time as wanting things to progress very quickly.
Thanks, Zoe. If any panel member has any final reflections before I pass over to Tony to say a few words. Okay, Tony, let me hand over to yourself now for some reflections.
John, thanks. Well, first of all, some thanks from me to the kind words that everybody said about the fellowships, and I'm so pleased that they're working. So thanks to everybody who's joining, including all the, hopefully many people I can't see on the screen here. But John, thanks very much to you for chairing it. John is a very shy man, so hasn't announced the fact that he's our new Vice President for Research in the university. And so, John, congratulations and well done. Absolutely delighted for that. And to Stephen and Kate, very busy people. I'm absolutely over the moon that you've been prepared to give up time to comment on these papers. And thanks very much for your comments. And to Zoe and Daniel, genuine thanks. I've read your papers. I am very impressed. And as somebody with degrees in economics and geography, the thought that struck, and a PhD in planning, that's not the show-off point, the thought that struck me was how important place is. I would say that, wouldn't I? But it's also a subsidiarity question, John. The thing that's come through from both these papers is, have we really thought through where we should take the decisions? Centrally, regionally, locally? And what comes through both in the resilience paper and the accountability paper is, have we got this right? And the other thought that struck me is the need for consistency. I think, Stephen, in the Levelling Up white paper, there's a long list of the very many initiatives on levelling up over the years. And I had the good fortune, I think I had the good fortune to be a government appointment on the Coalfields Regeneration Trust. And we kept saying to ministers and officials, you need to fund us for a long time, not because we want to keep going. It takes time to do this. And we need to have some more consistent policy. So place matters. And have we decided where we will allow regions and locality to make the kind of choices? And Zoe, you've made an important point there about when we could do that. So I think these are both very important reports. I hope they will contribute to the ongoing debate. I'm delighted that the Crook Fellowships have enabled this to happen. My hope in founding these, as John knows, because he was in on the early discussions on this, that it would enable policymakers to connect with researchers in our university. It would also enable our academics like Aidan, who doesn't need this really, to connect with policymakers so that our researchers, John, understood the nature of the policymaking process and how to engage and how to make a difference. My own experience is that you keep banging away over the long term and establish some kind of reputation and some kind of relationship. And one of my objectives in working on this, John, wasn't it? And you and I have worked on this with our colleague Craig Watkins for some time, was that we wanted these relationships between our academic colleagues and our fellows to endure over the long term. I'm not necessarily at the University of Sheffield. I mean, Zoe's already moved on. Aidan, you might move on. Not yet, please. We need you in our department. But these relationships will endure between individuals, not necessarily institutionally. And what's good, John, isn't it, that these relationships that we've helped fund in this way, you, I, and Craig and Katie supporting us, have already started to pay off. So we had a program that Stephen will remember as a member of the advisory group looking at inclusive education. And that's now paid off in a very big ESRC grant, I think, John, hasn't it? With some of the fellows now participating in that research. So, I mean, thank you, everybody, for the work that's being done. And let's hope that we can make a difference. I feel as an academic and a bit of a policy wonk, sitting on regeneration boards and other things, that one needs to spit in the wind a bit in order to make sure that one continues to be heard. Things don't happen in the long term, but I have still this blind faith that evidence will make a difference, and that's what the Crook Fellowship is about. And I've been absolutely delighted to do this. Thank you for being kind about it. What matters to me is not that it's got my name on. Previous Vice-Chancellor insisted on this, did he not, John? But actually that it's brought people like Aidan together with colleagues, with Zoe and with Daniel. And I'm delighted that it's worked so well. Nothing to do with my name. But the important thing is that we can look back in 5 years' time and say these reports did make a bit of a difference. But we have to bite on the issue of subsidiarity in our democratic structures, I think. And a group I'm involved with Vincent Goodstadt, who's the executive director of the 2070 Commission, is about to make a statement to a House of Lords committee saying we really have to have some national spatial strategies. We really have to have some regional strategies within which the local plans can work. And we really have to think about the constitutional and governance natures of the ways we make decisions in this country. Because if we don't, everything's going to revert to central government. And I'm not sure that's the right way to progress. I'm a bit pious about that, forgive me. I've had a couple of glasses of wine, which has enabled me to speak from the heart, if not from the brain. John, thanks.
Tony, thank you very much. And just to reflect on a couple of things before we finish. So the first thing, Tony's absolutely right about this being a two-way learning process. I was fortunate enough to work on a project in the very first cohort of the Crook Fellowship scheme. And I would tell you all now that I learned far more, I think, from the fellow I worked with than he learned from me. So there is so much that academics learn from this process as well. The second thing I was just going to reflect on was the actual idea of public service itself. And maybe it's my turn to be pious, Tony, or a bit nostalgic, but given the very threat to the definition of what public service actually means, given what we're watching at Westminster at the moment, I think actually the concept of public service is very, very important, and understanding that academics as well as public service practitioners and policymakers have a role to play. So there is something, I think, in the definition of public service that probably needs defending, as well as the kind of academic rigour that we try to take part in. I want to thank you in particular, Tony. I mean, this scheme, as I said, I think has gone from strength to strength. I would urge people to, include those that are joining us on the U player, to look at Daniel and Zoe and Aidan and Matt's reports, because they're excellent. Please also, we can help you if you want to look at any of the previous work that's come out of the fellowship scheme. I would encourage you to do so, because as Tony said, the really exciting thing is some of those were a platform both for further collaboration, but for actual meaningful change in the policy areas that they were engaged with. So, and just finally, I would like to thank you all. You've attended on a Thursday evening. I'd like to thank obviously Zoe and Daniel. Again, Stephen, Kate and Aidan, not just for participating, but for the evident work that you put into looking at the reports and coming up with really considered and insightful comments. Thanks to Katie and Lynette and Alistair for the support with the event this evening. And I'd also like to thank everybody else who's joined us this evening and taken part in the questions. So thank you all very much indeed. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you now, and good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, that